Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm an Airbus pilot, and welcome to our descent tutorial with the iniBuilds Airbus A350 in Microsoft Flight Simulator. We're slowly approaching our top of descent, which is now 12 nautical miles out, and we now have two options available. So either we might get an early descent, or we just get to descend when ready. In any case, if ATC doesn't give you descent instruction, I would request descent approximately 5 nautical miles prior to the top of descent down here on the cruise panel, so that we have a little bit of time available and don't overshoot. Now, when an early descent clearance is received, so you have to initiate the descent prior to the actual top of descent, then the aircraft is going to descend at 1000 feet a minute until it actually intercepts the profile. If you start the descent right at the top of descent itself, well, then it just goes right down on the profile. Let's go ahead and have a look at this. So we are now clear to descend to flight level 300. We dial the altitude down, but caution, the airplane will not start to descend automatically when you overfly the top of descent. You always need to press the altitude button in, and that's going to initiate descent mode, as you can see up here. So we got descent, alt, flight level 300 blue. Now, we kinda initiated the descent a little bit before the actual top of descent, so you can see how it goes down to 1000 feet a minute now, until at the actual top of descent, our VDEV dot is going to start coming down, and then the aircraft is eventually going to track that. Now, on the left side, on the speed scale, we now see a couple of additional markers. You've got the target speed down there, and then you have the maximum and the minimum speed that the aircraft is going to tolerate. If you come from an A320, you might notice thrust descent on the FMA, which you might not be used to. So what exactly is thrust descent about then? Basically, the aircraft doesn't go all the way into idle, but it sets a thrust a little bit above idle. That's to minimize the thermal shock of the engine by just going back to a lower thrust setting, and therefore increases engine life at the cost of a little bit shallower path, because obviously we are now above the actual idle thrust in thrust descent mode, so the airplane doesn't descend as steep as it would otherwise. But this is a very good compromise between efficiency and sustainability, respectively engine life. Now, just like in the climb, we do have different modes available in descent. The normal mode is the descent mode, however that is only available if you're in nav mode, so if you're navigating along the flight path on your navigation display. If you are flying in heading mode, then you cannot use the descent mode. However, you can use open descent mode. Now, let's talk about what open descent is. Open descent basically commands idle thrust if auto thrust is engaged, and then it is going to pitch to maintain the target speed exactly. So you can see right now, in descent mode, the aircraft favors tracking the predicted VNAV path over maintaining a very precise airspeed control. If we were to change to open descent, it would simply fly that speed over here, and it would disregard the VNAV path entirely. Do note that open descent is also going to disregard any restrictions you might have along your actual flight plan. So that's something rather important to keep in mind here. As we initiate our descent, we are normally somewhere around half an hour prior to landing, and that's a good moment in time to turn on the fasten seatbelt sign. Again, different operators are going to use different procedures for the fasten seatbelt sign. I've seen everything from turning it on at 10,000 feet to turning it on 15 minutes before landing, or at 15,000 feet, whichever is earlier. That was my former operator right there, to turning it on at 25,000 feet in the descent, or if the cruise altitude is below that, at the top of descent, that would be Emirates, to turning it on like half an hour or 40 minutes prior to landing, turning it on at the top of descent. There's a lot of different procedures there. The only thing all airlines have in common is that regardless of which procedure would be SOP, if you're about to enter turbulence, you're gonna turn that seatbelt sign on. Makes sense, doesn't it? If you think about it like that. Alright, let's continue our descent to a lower altitude, and let's have a look at a bit of the information that we can get from our avionics within the descent. So very similar to how systems worked in the climb. If you need to know when you can reach a certain altitude, you can do that on the descent panel. Just enter your altitude here, and then you're eventually going to get that prediction at what time and at what distance you can reach that altitude. You also see the exact vertical deviation from your target VNAV path down here on the VDEV indication, but you will notice that if you deviate more than 600 feet from the dot on the altimeter, you will also see the numbers next to the dot of how far high or low you are. The level of error on the nav display is probably rather self-explanatory. Now, on the descent we have to think about anti-ice. In the climb tutorial, I told you that we would turn the anti-ice on if the TAT is below 10 degrees and the SAT above minus 40 degrees. In the descent, that's a little bit different. In the descent, we basically turn the anti-ice on if the TAT is below plus 10 degrees Celsius and visible moisture exists, completely disregarding the SAT. So, if we put that sunshade up a little bit, if we look at the clouds outside over there, as soon as we expect to enter those clouds, we are going to turn the engine anti-ice on. Wing anti-ice is handled just like in the climb tutorial on a reactive basis, so if you see ice building up on the ice detector probe down here, that's your indication to turn on the wing anti-ice. In general, you want to use wing anti-ice in a way that you do not land with wings that are contaminated with ice. So it takes around 20-30 seconds to get rid of icing. Do that. Your wife is going to be thankful. Unless you have a good life insurance, then you may want to think about it. But the same should apply to all your passengers as well. Alright, so with that out of the way, that's the basic modes that we have available. Now, as we are descending down, we got to think about what's around us. So, is weather a factor? Is terrain a factor? And we do get some very good aid for that from the weather radar, because we can see there is just nothing over here. It's all black. And if we take a look into the weather that we uplinked, cavalcade at the destination. So weather is probably not going to be a factor in today's approach. For this reason, I'm going to switch over to terrain, since mountains most certainly are a factor on an approach into Vienna. So that's pretty useful of a thing to do. If we look down at our vertical display down here, we can get a couple of pieces of interesting information as well. So first of all, of course, we have our standard descent path over here. Now that's self-explanatory. However, you have more information than just that. Down here we can see our altitude constraints. We can see the window at NATEX that we have over here. So the level 140 is that one above, and the level 60 is the one at the bottom. So using the vertical display, we can actually judge at what altitudes the aircraft actually wants to be within that window. You can, of course, also take a look at the flight plan page, which should give you that piece of information as well. So over here you can see NATEX 10,560 feet, even though that is within that altitude constraint window. What's interesting as well is you can see that right after NATEX we have a little bit of a level segment. That's because the aircraft wants to reduce its speed down towards 250 knots over there, and then it resumes the descent down here towards Pacers. And from there we are probably going to fly some shortcuts onto our arrival. But let's go ahead and set the FCU altitude right down to 10,000 feet over here. And since that is below the transition level, we can already change over to the local QNH. And note that we do this as soon as we are cleared to descend to an altitude. We don't wait for the transition level, we do it straight away. That's how Airbus wants it. Remember that the logic on the altitude reference selector is actually reversed compared to the A320 and A330. So if you want to set some numbers yourself, you pull it out. and then it automatically jumps to the QNH that was previously selected. Also change over the ISIS to the local QNH down here, and when that is done, then cross-check your altitudes, and now you can choose to run the approach checklist already. That's basically up to the pilot. Normally, Airbus SOP is to run the approach checklist once you are below 10,000 feet, and since that is the Airbus SOP, we are going to do it that way, but Airbus does give you an option to run the approach checklist as soon as local QNH has been selected, so that's kind of up to the pilot. Well, and that much about the general procedures in the descent. Let's now talk a little bit about energy management, because that is something important that tends to be somewhat forgotten in flight simulation. So what do I mean with energy management? Well, the total energy of the aircraft equals the potential energy plus the kinetic energy. Potential energy is altitude. Kinetic energy is airspeed. So when we are thinking about descending an airliner, regardless which one it is, we always have to think about the total energy of the aircraft. By the time we land, that energy has got to be zero. That means no more altitude, no more speed. And that means we got to reduce both of them. So let's now have a look at a couple of options of how to manage our energy. We could be high on energy even if we are on the VNAV profile if our speed is somewhere up here. Likewise, we could be low on energy if we're on the profile but our speed is down here. The low on energy part is rather easy to solve as long as you have operative engines, as you simply add some thrust in order to convert chemical energy, that's fuel, into kinetic energy or potential energy as you like. Now, basically, you can convert kinetic energy into potential energy by speeding up or slowing down. So we could go for a dive now, increasing our kinetic energy, aka increasing our speed, and then we would lose potential energy because we would burn through altitude. In general, aircraft have more drag the faster they fly. So if you are getting high on profile, increasing your airspeed would be the first option that you would go for. The second option, if you can't lose your altitude, is to extend the speed brakes. Now, extending the speed brakes is kind of the last option that you want to go for, because it means that you are effectively destroying energy that you have already put into the system. Think about, you could have started the descent earlier, then you wouldn't need the speed brakes now. So the speed brakes always destroy energy and therefore create additional cost. If you can favor flying faster and using the natural drag that builds up, that reduces your flight time, therefore reduces the time the engine spent in idle thrust, and therefore reduces your fuel consumption. Therefore that's cheaper than to use the speed brake from a given situation. However, it is worth mentioning that while we did a lot of that accelerating, decelerating, energy management stuff on short haul, on the long hauls we are a little bit more conservative with that. The reason is that we just don't fly as often on the long hauls as we do on the short hauls, and therefore, well, we aren't that fit with the aircraft. There is a huge difference whether you do, 2 landings a month compared to 40 landings a month that you would do on a typical short haul operation. So that's most certainly something that you've got to keep in mind. And that's it about the energy management part. So always think about total energy. I often see flight simmers who are diving down on the profile, completely ignoring their speed, bringing the aircraft all the way to an overspeed, and then they wonder why they can't get a stable approach on the ILS. Well, because they're going 100 knots faster than they're supposed to. A general rule of thumb that you can use to calculate your energy management is you need 3 nautical miles per 1,000 feet and 1 nautical mile to lose 10 knots of speed in level flight. So that way you can sum up your exact position and your exact energy situation. As always, adding energy is easier than burning energy. It's always easier just to add a little bit of thrust than to use the speed brake and try to burn through that energy. But you will eventually have to make your own experiences there and see what you get most comfortable with. Most certainly it's easiest just to pull the speed brake, especially if you're tired after a long haul flight like the A350 can do them, so there's always that. And that shall finish our descent tutorial in the iniBuilds Airbus A350. Thank you very much for watching, I hope you liked it. Be sure to leave your feedback in the comments underneath the video, like, comment and subscribe, and if you really love what I'm doing on the channel, I would appreciate a small donation through the Buy Me Coffee link in the video description below. Thank you very much for watching, and I'm looking forward to see you all again on the next one.